The Grand Council Chamber was the largest structure Daehyun had ever seen. It stretched so far in every direction that the walls disappeared into a manufactured haze. Gravity shifted depending on where you stood, allowing thousands of alien delegates to orient themselves in their own preferred direction. Some hung upside down from what looked like the ceiling. Others floated in specially designated zero-gravity zones. The chamber could hold representatives from all 847 species that made up the Velthian Empire. And today, every seat was filled. Daehyun stood alone at the central platform. Around him, in concentric rings that rose higher and higher, sat beings of every imaginable shape and form. Crystalline entities that hummed with internal light, gaseous clouds held together by force fields, massive armored creatures that looked like they could crush a tank, delicate insectoid beings with too many limbs to count. And at the very top, on a throne that seemed to be carved from a single massive diamond, sat Emperor Velcros himself. The Emperor was a Velthian, a species that resembled living crystal. Light passed through his body in strange ways, creating rainbow patterns on the walls behind him. He was massive, easily 4 times the height of a human, and his voice carried a resonance that made the air vibrate, Human Velcros said, his voice booming through the chamber without need for amplification. You have been summoned to hear the judgment of the Galactic Empire. Your species has committed grave offenses against the natural order. Daehyun stood quietly, his hands clasped behind his back. He wore a simple gray suit, utterly plain compared to the elaborate robes and biological displays of the aliens around him. His face remained calm. The Emperor continued. Humanity has established colonies on 17 worlds without imperial permission. You have built military vessels in excess of your assigned quota. You have developed technologies without submitting them for imperial review. You have traded with other species as if you were their equals, rather than acknowledging your proper place in the hierarchy. A murmur ran through the assembled delegates. Some of them clicked or whistled or made sounds that human ears couldn't properly process. Daehyun recognized it as approval. The Empire had strict rules about who could do what, and humanity had indeed broken many of those rules. But the greatest offense, Velcros said, his crystalline form glowing brighter, is your arrogance. You arrived in this galaxy a mere 300 cycles ago. 300 cycles. Some of the species here have served the Empire for 10,000 cycles, yet you act as if you owe us nothing. As if you are somehow special. Daehyun allowed himself a small smile. It wasn't a nervous smile or an apologetic one. It was the kind of smile someone might wear when hearing an old joke they'd expected. The Emperor noticed. His glow intensified with what Daehyun recognized as anger. You find this amusing, human? Forgive me, Your Majesty, Daehyun said. His voice was quiet compared to the Emperor's, but the chamber's acoustics carried it clearly. I meant no disrespect. Please, continue. Velcro stared at him for a long moment, then proceeded. The Empire has been generous with your species. We allowed you to keep your homeworld. We permitted you to expand to nearby systems. We asked only for tribute and obedience, as we ask of all species. But you have shown yourselves to be ungrateful and rebellious. The Emperor raised one crystalline arm, and the chamber fell silent. Therefore, the Empire issues this ultimatum. You will surrender all colony worlds to Imperial administration. You will dismantle all military vessels except for those required for basic system defense. You will accept Imperial governors on all human worlds. You will pay reparations for your violations. And you will formally acknowledge Velthian supremacy over all human affairs. Another murmur, louder this time. Several delegates seemed pleased. A few looked uncomfortable, though Daehyun couldn't read alien expressions well enough to be certain. You have 30 standard cycles to comply, Velcro said. If you refuse, the Empire will consider it an act of war. The consequences will be severe. The chamber waited. This was the moment when most species begged, pleaded, or tried to negotiate. Some accepted immediately. A rare few showed defiance. But that defiance was usually tinged with fear or desperation. Daehyun simply smiled again, broader this time. Your Majesty, if I may. I would like to request 48 hours to consult with my government before responding formally. The Emperor's glow flickered in what might have been confusion. 48 hours? Yes, Your Majesty. This is an important decision. I should not make it without proper consultation. For a moment, the chamber was utterly silent. Then Velcros began to laugh. It was a sound like crystal bells being struck, beautiful and cold. Other delegates joined in, creating a cacophony of alien laughter that echoed through the massive space. Very well, human, Velcros said. Take your 48 hours. Consult with your leaders. Perhaps they will show more wisdom than you have shown today. He waved a crystalline hand dismissively. This assembly is concluded. Daehyun bowed slightly and turned to leave. As he walked toward the exit, he could feel thousands of alien eyes on his back. Some pitying, some contemptuous, some simply curious about what humanity would do. The shuttle back to the human diplomatic ship was quiet. Daehyun sat alone in the passenger compartment, looking out at the stars. The Empire's capital station orbited a massive gas giant, and the view was objectively beautiful. But Daehyun wasn't really seeing it. When he arrived at the ship, 3 people were waiting for him in the briefing room. Hannah stood by the viewport, her military bearing obvious despite her civilian clothes. She had served 15 years in the Colonial Defense Forces before joining the diplomatic corps. Taeyang sat at the table, reviewing files on his datapad. He was the team's xenopsychology expert, the person who helped them understand how aliens thought. And Minji leaned against the wall, arms crossed, her sharp eyes watching the door. Well, Mingi asked as soon as Daehyun entered. How bad? As expected, Daehyun said, taking a seat. Complete surrender or war. 30 cycles. Hannah turned from the viewport. Did you smile? I smiled. And they laughed. Velcros especially. Daehyun pulled up a holographic display showing the Empire's military deployment. Taeyang, were you right about their psychology? Taeyang nodded. The Velthians are status-obsessed. They interpret any sign of fear as confirmation of their superiority. If you had begged or shown anxiety, they would have seen it as weakness. The smile confused them, but Daehyun said, Confusion is what we need right now. Minji moved to the table and brought up her own files. My sources confirm what we suspected. The Empire has never fought a peer conflict. In 10,000 years, they've conquered hundreds of species, but always primitive ones or pacifistic ones. Species that couldn't fight back effectively, Hannah added. Their military doctrine is based entirely on overwhelming force against stationary targets. They're good at sieges and orbital bombardments. They have huge fleets and vast armies. But they've never faced an enemy that uses mobile warfare or unconventional tactics. Because they've never needed to, Taeyang said. Why develop sophisticated strategy when you can just throw massive force at every problem? Daehyun studied the displays. Red icons showed Imperial fleet positions. Blue icons showed human colonies and assets. The Empire outnumbered humanity by factors that would have terrified most species. But numbers weren't everything. Earth's response? He asked. Minji smiled. It was a predatory expression. Fleet Admiral Juan sends her regards. She says the Colonial Defense Forces are ready. The contingency plans are in place. Every colony knows what to do. And the diplomatic initiative? Already in motion? We've made contact with 17 subjugated species. Most are interested. Some are eager. The Kresh, especially. They've been under Imperial rule for 800 years, and they hate it. Daehyun leaned back in his chair. Then we proceed as planned. Minji, send a message to Earth. Tell them the ultimatum was delivered exactly as intelligence predicted. Tell them I'll deliver our response in 48 hours. What will you tell them? Hannah asked. The truth, Daehyun said. That humanity declines their generous offer. That we propose instead a partnership of equals. And that if they insist on war, they should reconsider very carefully. Taeyang looked worried. They'll see that as arrogance. It might make them angrier. Let them be angry, Daehyun said. Angry enemies make mistakes. Humans learned that lesson the hard way over centuries of warfare on Earth. The Empire is about to learn it too. The four of them sat in silence for a moment, each contemplating what was about to happen. War with the greatest empire the galaxy had ever known. War against impossible odds. War that, by all logical analysis, humanity should lose. But Daehyun was still smiling, because he knew something the Empire didn't. Something that made all the difference. Humanity hadn't clawed its way up from a death world, survived 3 near-extinction events, and reached the stars by accepting impossible odds. They had done it by making the impossible possible. The Velthian Empire was about to discover why you should never corner a species that has nothing left to lose and everything to prove. 48 hours passed quickly. When Daehyun returned to the Grand Council chamber, the atmosphere was different. The assembled delegates seemed more eager, more excited. They had gathered to witness humanity's submission, and the anticipation was obvious in the way. They shifted in their seats and whispered to one another. Emperor Velcros sat on his diamond throne, his crystalline form glowing with satisfaction. He had no doubt about how this would end. Every species eventually bent the knee. It was simply how things worked. Daehyun took his position at the central platform. He carried a small data device, which he placed on the speaker's podium. The room fell silent.
Your Majesty,
Daehyun began, his voice clear and steady. I have consulted with my government. Earth has carefully considered the Empire's ultimatum, and we have reached a decision. Proceed, Velcro said. Waving one hand, Earth respectfully declines. The silence that followed was absolute. For several heartbeats, no one moved. Then the chamber exploded into noise. Delegates shouted in dozens of languages. Some stood from their seats. Others made aggressive displays that their species used to show anger or disbelief. Velcros raised both arms. The chamber fell silent again. His glow had shifted to a harsh, angry red. You decline. Yes, Your Majesty. However, Earth would like to make a counter-proposal. We suggest a partnership of equals. We offer to share technology, establish trade agreements, and work together for mutual benefit. We believe this would be more advantageous for both our peoples than conflict. The Emperor's laughter rang out like shattering glass. Partnership equals. You dare suggest that humanity, a species barely off its homeworld, should be equal to the Velthian Empire. He leaned forward on his throne. You are either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid human. Perhaps both, Your Majesty, Daehyun said calmly. But I must deliver one final message from Earth. My government wishes to make clear that war would be unfortunate for all parties. We urge the Empire to reconsider. Velcro stood, his full height dominating the chamber. The Empire does not reconsider. The Empire does not negotiate with primitives who forget their place. You have made your choice, human. Now you will face the consequences. He pointed one crystalline finger at Daehyun. The Third Conquest Fleet will be dispatched immediately. Your nearest colony will be the first to fall. And when your worlds are burning, when your ships are dust, when your people are begging for mercy, perhaps then you will understand the folly of your arrogance. The chamber erupted in approval. Delegates from dozens of species cheered and clicked, and howled their support for the Emperor's declaration. Daehyun simply nodded. Then I suppose we have nothing more to discuss. If Your Majesty would allow me to return to my ship? Go, Velcros said dismissively. You will remain on this station as our guest until the war is concluded. Perhaps watching your species defeat will teach you humility. As Daehyun left the chamber, he caught sight of a few delegates who were not celebrating. A small reptilian being from a subjugated world looked troubled. A floating jellyfish-like creature seemed thoughtful rather than excited. But most of the assembly was caught up in the fervor of impending victory. Back on the human ship, Daehyun's team was already in motion. Hannah stood at the tactical display, coordinating with colonial defense forces across human space. Taeyang monitored Imperial communications, analyzing their military preparations. Mingi was in contact with resistance cells on subjugated worlds. The Third Conquest Fleet is moving, Hannah reported. 300 capital ships, 2,000 support vessels. They're heading for New Jeju, as we predicted. Governor Haiyan, Daehyun asked. already implementing Protocol Exodus. Civilian evacuation is ahead of schedule. The defense grid is powering up. Far across the galaxy, on the agricultural world of New Jeju, Governor Hyene watched as the last transport ships lifted into orbit. The planet's surface looked peaceful from his command center, buried 3 kilometers beneath a grain processing facility. Fields of golden crops swayed in the wind. Small towns dotted the landscape. It looked like exactly what the Empire thought it was, a simple farming colony with minimal defenses. Status. Hyene asked his defense coordinator. All civilians evacuated. Defense platforms at 90% power. Drone swarms ready for deployment. Ground-to-orbit batteries charged. Stealth fields holding. Hyene nodded. New Jeju had been settled 20 years ago as part of humanity's expansion plan. But from the very beginning, it had been designed with defense in mind. The grain processing facilities doubled as military command centers. The irrigation systems concealed power conduits. The silos held weapons as well as food. And the orbital satellites that monitored crop growth were also sophisticated sensor and weapon platforms. How long until they arrive? Hyene asked. 6 hours, Governor. Then we wait. The third Conquest Fleet emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation. Grand Admiral Thevak stood on the bridge of his flagship, a massive dreadnought that had been present at 47 successful invasions. He was a Gorthian, a species that resembled bipedal bears covered in metallic scales. His species had served the Empire for 3,000 years. Scan the system, he ordered. His sensor officer, a multi-armed being from an aquatic world, worked its controls. 1 inhabited planet. Minimal orbital infrastructure. No significant fleet presence detected. Several hundred small vessels, mostly transports and cargo ships. Thevak grunted in satisfaction. Pathetic? Open a channel to the planet. The communication was brief. Thevak demanded immediate surrender. When no response came, he ordered the fleet to advance. Begin standard siege formation, he commanded. Capital ships will establish orbital supremacy. Support vessels will deploy ground forces. This should be concluded within 12 hours. But as the fleet approached the planet, something strange happened. The satellites that had appeared inactive suddenly lit up. Energy readings spiked across the entire orbital space. Admiral, we're detecting massive power signatures, the sensor officer reported, confusion evident in its voice. The satellites are not satellites. They're weapons platforms. What? Thevak stepped closer to the display. That's impossible. Intelligence reported minimal defenses, and the platforms opened fire. Humanity had learned something during its violent history. When you're outmatched in size and strength, you don't fight fair. You use every advantage, every trick, every unconventional method available. The orbital platforms were built using technology the Empire had never seen. Developed during humanity's colonial expansion without Imperial oversight, directed energy weapons sliced through Imperial shields like they weren't there. Missile swarms launched from hidden surface installations, each one independently targeting and adjusting course to hit weak points in Imperial vessels. And from the planet itself, thousands of drones poured into space, small and fast and deadly, evasive maneuvers. Thevak shouted, "Return fire." But the Imperial fleet was not built for evasive maneuvers. Their ships were massive, powerful, designed to absorb damage and overwhelm fixed defenses. They had never needed to dodge before. The drones swarmed around them like insects, targeting engines and weapons and sensor arrays. Then the human ships arrived. They had been waiting in the outer system, hidden among asteroid fields and gas giant rings. They were smaller than Imperial vessels, a quarter the size of even the smallest Imperial destroyer. But they were fast, incredibly fast. Contact. Multiple vectors, the sensor officer called out. 80 human vessels closing at high speed. The human ships didn't engage in the kind of broadside warfare the Empire practiced. They flashed past Imperial vessels, firing precisely targeted weapons at critical systems, then vanished before return fire could hit them. They worked in coordinated groups. Focusing fire on individual targets until shields collapsed and holes breached, Thevak watched in growing horror as his fleet, the third conquest fleet that had never known defeat, started to fall apart. A cruiser lost power and began drifting. A carrier's launch bays exploded from internal fires. His own flagship shook as drone strikes overwhelmed the point defense systems. "We need reinforcements," his tactical officer said. "No," Thevak snarled. "We outnumber them. We outmass them. Push forward. All ships, full attack pattern." But the human fleet refused to stand and fight in the way Imperial doctrine expected. They hit and ran, appeared and vanished, struck from unexpected angles, and the orbital defenses kept firing. An unending barrage that never seemed to diminish. 6 hours after the battle began, Thevak made the hardest decision of his career. All ships, withdraw. Retreat to Rally Point Gamma. The third conquest fleet limped away from New Jeju, leaving behind 43 destroyed vessels and countless damaged ones. Not a single Imperial soldier had set foot on the planet's surface. The simple farming colony had defeated the finest fleet in the galaxy. In the Grand Council chamber, Emperor Velcros received the report in stunned silence. Around him, delegates who had been celebrating hours earlier now sat in shock. "This is impossible," Velcros said. "Grand Admiral Thevak is one of our best commanders. The Third Fleet has never failed." His military advisor, a spider-like being with too many eyes, shifted nervously. "Your Majesty, the humans appear to use tactics we have not encountered before. Perhaps we underestimated their capabilities." "Then we will not underestimate again," Velcros said, his glow intensifying. "Dispatch the 5th and 7th Fleets as well. Triple our force. Humanity will be crushed, and crushed quickly." Before this setback damages Imperial prestige further. But across the Empire, in the homes and habitats of 1,000 subjugated species, word of the defeat was already spreading. And for the first time in 10,000 years, beings who had accepted their fate began to wonder, what if the Empire could be beaten? Fleet Admiral Juwan sat in the command center beneath Earth's moon, watching holographic displays that showed the entire theater of war. She was a small woman with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had served in humanity's military for 40 years, rising through the ranks, not through political connections, but through pure competence. Around her, dozens of officers coordinated humanity's defense. Each one managed a different sector, a different aspect of the war effort. But they all reported to Giwan, and she saw the bigger picture that none of them could fully grasp. "Status report," she said quietly. Commander Bora, her chief tactical officer, brought up a system map. "The 5th and 7th Imperial fleets have joined the 3rd at Rally Point Gamma. Combined force of 800 capital ships. They're regrouping and preparing for a coordinated assault." "Let them prepare," Giwan said. "Where are they planning to strike?" "Intelligence suggests they'll split their forces. Hit 3 colonies simultaneously to spread our defenses." Guan smiled slightly. It was the kind of smile that made junior officers nervous because it usually meant she had seen something they hadn't. "I still think this is about holding territory. Taiyang, what's your analysis?" Taiyang appeared on a secondary screen from his station on the diplomatic ship. "Admiral, the Empire's entire military philosophy is based on siege warfare and occupation. They take planets and hold them. They've never fought an enemy that treats space itself as the battlefield." "Exactly," Giwan said. She zoomed out the display, showing not just human colonies, but the vast empty space between stars. "We don't need to hold every planet. We need to make them bleed for every light year they cross." Over the next several weeks, the Imperial fleets pushed deeper into human space. They attacked New Busan, a mining colony on an airless moon. They hit New Daegu, a research station orbiting a gas giant. They struck at New Incheon, a shipyard facility in a binary star system. And each time, they won. But winning felt wrong. Grand Admiral Thevak stood on his flagship bridge, studying casualty reports. His fleet had taken New Busan after a 3-day battle. The colony was now under Imperial control. The human defenders had evacuated before the final assault, leaving behind only automated defenses and booby traps. The victory had cost him 8 ships and 2,000 soldiers. "Admiral," his tactical officer said, "we've secured the mining facility, but the humans demolished all the processing equipment before they left. It will take months to rebuild." Thevak growled low in his throat. "What about the stockpiled resources?" "Gone. They evacuated everything they could carry and destroyed the rest." It was the same story at New Daegu. The research station was captured, but all the data was wiped and the scientists evacuated. At New Inshin, the shipyards were in ruins, sabotaged beyond repair. The Empire was winning battles but gaining nothing, and the humans kept hitting back in ways that made no sense. Supply convoys traveling through what should have been secure space were ambushed. Communication relays were destroyed by fast-tack ships that appeared from nowhere. Imperial vessels on patrol duty simply vanished. Found weeks later as debris fields with no explanation for what killed them, they're fighting like cowards. One of Thevak's captains complained during a strategy meeting. "They won't stand and face us in open battle. They're fighting smart," Thevak corrected, though the words tasted bitter. "They know they can't win a straight fight, so they refuse to fight one." Back on Earth's moon, Giwan was pleased with the progress. Every day the war continued was a day the Empire hemorrhaged resources. Every ambush forced them to divert ships to escort duty. Every hit-and-run attack made them more cautious, slower to advance. "We're not trying to win," she explained to her officers during a briefing. "Not yet. We're trying to make them pay such a high price that their whole system starts to crack." "What do you mean, Admiral?" Commander Bora asked. G1 brought up a new display, this one showing economic and resource data for the Empire. The Velthian Empire controls 847 species across tens of thousands of worlds. But they don't actually produce anything themselves. They take tribute from subjugated species, food from agricultural worlds, minerals from mining colonies, soldiers from warrior races. Everything is taken, nothing is given. She highlighted several regions where the data showed declining tribute shipments. The war is expensive. The Emperor is demanding more resources, more soldiers, more ships. But the subjugated species are starting to resist. Not openly, not yet. But look at these numbers. Production is down. Shipments are delayed. Accidents are increasing. Taiyang appeared on the screen again. It's what we predicted. The Empire's power is based on fear and overwhelming force. But if that force appears beatable, the whole structure becomes unstable. So we keep bleeding them, Joanne said. We keep making them pay. And we wait for the cracks to become breaks. While the military bled the Empire in space, Minji's intelligence network was working a different battlefield. She sat in a secure room on the diplomatic ship, communicating with agents across Imperial space through encrypted channels that the Empire couldn't crack. "Status report from the Kresh Resistance?" she asked. An agent's voice came through, digitally altered for security. "They've received the weapons we sent. Training is progressing. They're ready to act when you give the signal." In the Valak. "Same. They've been waiting for a chance to strike back for 800 years. They're more than ready." Minji checked her list. 17 different species, all with their own reasons to hate the Empire. Some had been conquered recently and still remembered freedom. Others had been subjugated so long that rebellion was a half-forgotten dream. But all of them shared one thing: a burning desire for revenge. The key was coordination. A single rebellion could be crushed. Even a dozen separate uprisings could be handled by the Empire's vast security forces. But if they all rose at once, if the Empire suddenly had to fight on 100 fronts while also dealing with humanity, then something might break. "Tell them to prepare," Minji said. "But wait for my signal. Timing is everything." On the Imperial capital station, Daehyun was still a guest, which meant a prisoner who was treated politely. He had comfortable quarters and access to diplomatic channels. He could even move freely around the public areas of the station. But he couldn't leave, and Imperial guards watched him constantly. He used his freedom to observe and to talk. The station held representatives from hundreds of species, and many of them wanted to speak with the human who had defied the Emperor. Some were hostile, viewing humanity as dangerous rebels, but others were curious, even sympathetic. One evening, Dehan found himself in a common area where delegates often gathered to exchange information and gossip. A small reptilian being approached him nervously. It was a Kresh, one of the species Mingi was working with. Ambassador Dehayan. The being said in heavily accented human language, "May I speak with you?" Of course, they found a quiet corner. The Kresh looked around nervously before speaking. "My name is Kess. I represent the Kresh people in this assembly, though we have no real power here. I wanted to ask, is it true? Did your people really defeat the Third Fleet? We defended ourselves successfully, yes?" Kess's eyes widened. "But how? The Empire has the largest military in known space. Everyone knows resistance is impossible." Dehayan considered his words carefully. There were probably listening devices everywhere, and he had to assume the Empire monitored his conversations. But some things needed to be said. "Resistance is only impossible if you accept that it's impossible," he said quietly. "The Empire has great strength, yes, but strength has weaknesses. Size makes you slow. Power makes you confident. And confidence makes you careless. But the cost," Kess said, "even if you win battles, the Empire will never stop. They'll send more fleets, more soldiers. They'll destroy your worlds rather than accept defeat." Perhaps Dehan agreed. But there's something the Empire doesn't understand about humanity. We're used to losing. We've lost more battles than most species have ever fought. We've faced extinction more times than we can count. But we're still here because we never accept that losing a battle means losing the war. He leaned closer to the small alien. "Do you know what humans learn from our history? That empires always fall eventually. Always. They grow too large, too confident, too rigid. And when they fall, it's often not because of external enemies. It's because they can't adapt, can't change, can't imagine being anything other than what they've always been." Kess was silent for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "There are others who think as I do. Others who wonder if things could be different." "Then perhaps you should talk to those others," Dehayan said. "Share your thoughts. Make preparations. Because when things change, and I believe they will, it would be good if your people were ready." Kess nodded and quickly left. Dehayan knew the conversation had been monitored. He also knew that the Imperial security forces probably had files on every potential resistance cell. But there was a difference between knowing resistance existed and actually stopping it. The Empire was learning that lesson slowly. Back in the Lunar Command Center, Giwan received a new intelligence report. "Admiral, we're seeing increased Imperial fleet movements in the Corvus sector. They're pulling ships away from garrison duty to reinforce the fleets attacking us. That's what it looks like." Giwan studied the map. The Corvus sector contained 7 subjugated worlds, all of them with histories of unrest. Pulling garrison forces away from those worlds was a risk. But the Empire was getting desperate. The war was lasting longer than they had expected, costing more than they had planned for. They needed to end it quickly. "How long until the rebellions are ready?" she asked. Commander Bora checked her secure channel to Mingi. 2 weeks, Admiral? Maybe less. Then we give them 2 weeks, Giwan said. She turned to her tactical team. I want our fleets to step up operations. Make the Empire think we're getting aggressive. Force them to commit more resources. And someone get me a connection to Governor Hyen on New Jeju. I have a job for him. Across human space, in the vast darkness between stars. On worlds the Empire thought it owned and in ships they thought they controlled, pieces were moving into place. The Empire saw rebellious humans who refused to accept their proper place. They saw a military problem that needed more force to solve. They didn't see the trap closing around them. They didn't understand that humanity wasn't fighting to win territories or capture resources. They were fighting to break the system itself, to shatter the illusion of imperial invincibility, so completely that it could never be repaired. The war was about to enter its next phase. And when it did, the Empire would finally understand what they were really facing. The signal came at midnight. Empire Standard Time. Across 23 different worlds, in underground shelters and hidden facilities, in quiet homes and secret meeting places, Resistance leaders received the same simple message. Now, on Kresh Prime. Kess stood in a warehouse that officially stored agricultural equipment, but actually concealed weapons that Minji's network had smuggled in over months. Around him, 300 Kresh fighters waited, their scales reflecting the dim light. They were farmers and merchants, teachers and factory workers. They were not soldiers, but they had been preparing for this moment for generations. Tonight, Kess said, his voice steady despite his fear, we take back our world. Remember, our targets are communication arrays and government buildings. Avoid civilian casualties. Show the Empire that we are not terrorists, we are freedom fighters. Similar speeches were happening on Velok Station. We're floating jellyfish-like, beings prepared to seize control of the orbital defense platforms they had been forced to maintain for Imperial use. On Thros, heavily armored beings who had been bred for labor were finally turning their strength against their masters. On world after world, species that had been silent for centuries found their voices. The uprisings began within minutes of each other. Imperial garrison forces, already reduced because of the war with humanity, found themselves facing coordinated attacks from populations they thought were pacified. Communication networks went down. Government buildings were occupied. In some places, Imperial governors were captured. In others, they fled. Emperor Velcros received the first reports an hour after the uprisings began. He was in his private chambers, a vast crystalline hall that glittered with reflected light. When his chief security advisor burst in without even requesting permission to enter, Your Majesty, we have a situation. Velcros turned, his glow shifting to an angry red. This had better be important to interrupt me. Rebellions, Your Majesty. Multiple worlds. At least 20, perhaps more. Coordinated attacks on Imperial facilities. For a moment, Velcros stood frozen. Then he moved toward the command chamber with surprising speed. Show me. The holographic display showed the Empire in miniature. With red markers appearing across its territory like a spreading disease, Kresh Prime, Velok Station, Thros, the Pelvic Colonies, the Gorth Reaches, world after world lighting up with reports of violence and unrest. How is this possible? Velcros demanded. Our intelligence services should have detected this. They did, Your Majesty, the advisor said nervously. We have files on resistance movements on many of these worlds, but they were small, disorganized. We didn't think they posed a serious threat, and now they have weapons. Real weapons? Military grade. And they're using sophisticated tactics. Someone has been training them. Velcros's crystalline form blazed with fury. The humans, we believe so, Your Majesty. Our analysts think this has been planned for months, possibly longer. While we were focused on the war with humanity, they were arming and organizing resistance movements across our territory. The Emperor stared at the display, watching as more red markers appeared. Recall the 5th and 7th fleets. We need to suppress these rebellions immediately, Your Majesty. That will leave our war with humanity under strength. Do you think I don't know that? Velcro snarled. But if we don't stop these rebellions now, if we let them spread, we could lose entire sectors. The humans can wait. Our empire's at stake, the order went out. Across space, Imperial fleets that had been pursuing humanity suddenly changed course, redirecting towards subjugated worlds and flames. It was exactly what G1 had been waiting for. Now the Imperial fleets are splitting, Commander Bora reported from the Lunar Command Center. Half are moving to suppress the rebellions. Guan allowed herself a satisfied smile. Then it's time to stop running. Activate Operation Hammer. All fleets. Offensive operations. Target the remaining Imperial forces. For months, humanity had been on the defensive, retreating and harassing, but never directly confronting the Imperial military. Now, that changed. Human fleets that had been scattered across dozens of systems consolidated into strike forces. And they didn't just defend, they attacked. The 4th Imperial Fleet was stationed at an occupied human colony, preparing to move to a new target, when human ships emerged from hyperspace on 3 sides. The Imperial commander barely had time to order defensive formations before the humans were on him. This time, the human ships didn't hit and run. They pressed the attack, overwhelming shields with concentrated fire and targeting command ships with precision strikes. The battle lasted for hours. When it was over, the Fourth Imperial Fleet no longer existed. Similar attacks happened across human space. Imperial forces that had grown comfortable, that had started to think the humans were beaten, found themselves facing an enemy that suddenly seemed twice as strong as before. The truth was that humanity's fleet strength hadn't changed, but their tactics had. Without the need to protect every colony, without the need to spread their forces thin, they could concentrate their power. Grand Admiral Thevak found himself commanding a fleet that was suddenly outnumbered. He sat in his command chair reviewing reports that made no sense. How had the humans hidden so many ships? Where had this strength come from? "Admiral," his tactical officer said, "we're receiving orders from the capital. We're to disengage and move to the Kresh system to suppress a rebellion." Thak wanted to argue. His mission was to defeat humanity, and now, just when the humans were finally engaging in open battle, he was being pulled away. But orders were orders. Acknowledged. Prepare the fleet for hyperspace. As the Imperial forces retreated, human ships followed but didn't press too hard. They had made their point. The Empire couldn't fight humanity and suppress rebellions at the same time. They had to choose. Emperor Velcros made his choice. Order had to be restored. The rebellions had to be crushed. And so the Imperial military, the greatest fighting force the galaxy had ever known, turned inward. They brought their overwhelming power down on subjugated worlds, and in many cases, they won. Kresh Prime fell back under Imperial control after 3 days of brutal fighting. The pelvic colonies were subdued. The Gorth reaches were pacified with orbital bombardments that left cities in ruins, but victories came at a terrible cost. The Velok, after they lost control of their station, chose to destroy it rather than let it fall back into Imperial hands. 3,000 Imperial soldiers died in the explosion. On Thros, the armored natives fought with a ferocity that shocked Imperial commanders used to easy conquests. Every building had to be cleared, every street fought for. And when the Thros finally lost, they'd killed 5 Imperial soldiers for every one of their own dead. And while the Empire was fighting its own subjects, humanity was advancing. New Busan was retaken. New Dagu was liberated. Human fleets pushed into territory the Empire had held for centuries, offering freedom to any species that wanted it. In the Grand Council chamber, Emperor Velcros faced his assembled advisors. The chamber felt different now. Half the delegate seats were empty, their represent. Adivus recalled to deal with crises on their homeworlds. The atmosphere was tense, uncertain. How bad is it? Velcros asked his military advisor. The spider-like being shifted nervously. 17 worlds are in open rebellion. We've suppressed 8, but fighting continues on the others. Casualties among our forces are at 40%. Supply lines are disrupted. Morale is declining, and the humans. They've retaken most of their colonies and are advancing into the outer rim. We estimate their fleet strength at 60% of original capacity. But they're using their forces more effectively now. They've learned from every engagement. Velcros turned to his political advisor, a being made of living shadow. What about the other subjugated species? The ones who haven't rebelled? Watching and waiting, Your Majesty. If we can crush these rebellions quickly and decisively, they may remain loyal. But if the fighting continues, if it appears we're losing control, we'll join the rebellion, Velcros finished. He looked around the chamber at the worried faces of his remaining supporters. How did it come to this? We are the Velthian Empire. We have ruled for 10,000 years. How can we be threatened by one young species and a handful of rebels? No one had an answer. On the diplomatic ship, Dahayan received a message from Admiral Juwan. It was brief. Phase 3 is ready. Are you prepared? Dahayan looked at his team. Hannah was coordinating with human fleets. Taeyong was analyzing Imperial communications for signs of surrender. Minji was managing the resistance networks. They were all exhausted, having worked without rest for weeks. But they were also determined. Send my response, Dahayan said. I'm ready. 20 hours later, a human fleet arrived at the Imperial capital. It was smaller than the defending forces, just 60 ships compared to over 100 Imperial vessels. But Admiral Giwan was not there to fight. Not yet. She broadcast a message on all frequencies, a message that every species in the system could receive. This is Fleet Admiral Juwan of Earth. I speak to all beings in this system, not just to the Imperial forces. Humanity has no quarrel with you. We do not seek to conquer or subjugate. We offer only one thing: freedom. She paused, then continued. Any ship that does not wish to fight can leave. Any species that wants independence can have it. We will protect you from Imperial reprisals. This is not a threat. This is a promise. The war is ending. The only question is, how much more blood will be spilled before it does? In the Imperial fleet, dozens of captains faced an impossible choice. Many were from subjugated species, commanding ships in service to an empire they had never chosen to serve. They looked at their crews, their fellow officers, and they saw the same doubt in every face. The first ship to break formation was a destroyer, commanded by a Velak captain who had lost his family when Velak Station was destroyed. He broadcast his own message: I will not fight for an empire that murdered my people. Any ship that wishes to join me, follow. 7 more ships followed him, then 12, then 30. Within an hour, the Imperial fleet had lost half its strength. Some ships left the system entirely. Others moved to join the human fleet, offering their allegiance to whatever came next. Emperor Velcros watched from his capital station. His crystalline form dimmed with despair. His unbeatable fleet was crumbling. His eternal empire was fracturing. And a single human fleet, outnumbered and outgunned on paper, now controlled the space around his capital. His chief security advisor approached. Your Majesty, the remaining fleet commanders are requesting orders. Should they engage the humans? Velcros looked at the holographic display showing his empire in tatters. Red markers everywhere, showing rebellions and lost worlds and fractured loyalties. He thought about 10,000 years of Velthian rule, of the certainty that had always defined his species. They were superior. They were destined to rule. It was simply the natural order. But natural orders could change. Certainties could be proven wrong. And sometimes the only way to survive was to admit you had been mistaken. No, Velcro said quietly. Open a channel to the human fleet. I wish to speak with their commander. The holographic projection of Emperor Velcros appeared on the bridge of Admiral Giwan's flagship. The crystalline being looked smaller somehow, his glow diminished. Giwan stood before the projection, her posture straight and formal. Emperor Velcros, she said with a slight nod. Admiral Giwan, Velcros replied. His voice still carried that resonant quality, but the arrogance was gone. I suppose you are here to dictate terms of surrender. I'm here to end a war that should never have started, Giwan said. What happens next depends on you. Velcros was silent for a moment. Around him, in the image, Giwan could see other Velthians, advisors and generals looking defeated. What are your terms? Unconditional surrender of Imperial forces. Dissolution of the Empire as a governing body. Freedom for all subjugated species to choose their own governments. And trials for those who committed war crimes during your rule. You ask us to end 10,000 years of civilization. I ask you to end 10,000 years of tyranny, Giwan corrected. There's a difference. The Velthian people will not be harmed. You will have a place in whatever comes next. But the Empire as it was is finished. Velcros looked at something off-screen, perhaps consulting with his advisors. When he turned back, his glow had dimmed even further. And if I refuse, if we fight to the last ship, then many beings will die unnecessarily, Giwan said. Human, Velthian, and dozens of other species caught in the fighting. The outcome won't change. Your fleet is fractured. Your empire is in rebellion. You've already lost your majesty. I'm offering you a chance to end this with dignity. The emperor stood silent for what felt like minutes. Then, slowly, he lowered his head. I accept your terms. The Imperial fleet will stand down. I will broadcast an order ending all military operations. A wise choice, Juan said. Perhaps, Velcros replied. Or perhaps simply the only choice left. The projection flickered. I have one request, Admiral. When your diplomat comes to formalize the surrender, I would like to speak with him. With Daehyun? There are things I wish to understand. I'll arrange it, Juan said. 2 days later, Daehyun stood once more in the Grand Council chamber. But it was a very different place now. The vast space was barely half full. Many species had already left, their representatives departing to deal with the chaos on their homeworlds. The delegates who remained looked uncertain. Lost without the clear hierarchy that had defined their existence, Emperor Velcros sat on his diamond throne. But there were no guards flanking him, no advisors whispering counsel. He was alone, a crystalline being who had lost his empire. Daehyun approached the throne and bowed slightly. Your Majesty, you don't need to call me that anymore, Velcros said. That title means nothing now. It means what you make it mean, Daehyun replied. A title is just a word. What matters is the being behind it. Velcros studied the human for a long moment. When you smiled that first day when I declared war, what were you thinking? Daehyun considered the question carefully. I was thinking that you had made a terrible mistake. Not because humanity is special or superior, but because you didn't understand us. You saw a young species, primitive by your standards, and you assumed we would react like all the others. But we're not like the others. That became clear, Velcros said dryly. Humanity spent thousands of years fighting itself, Daehyun continued. We had wars that nearly destroyed our species. We developed weapons that could end all life on our planet. We faced extinction not from external enemies, but from our own worst impulses. And somehow we survived. We learned. We grew. Not because we were strong, but because we refused to give up even when giving up made sense. He took a step closer. When you threatened us, when you demanded we surrender or be destroyed, you didn't realize what you were actually doing. You were challenging a species that has built its entire existence around overcoming impossible challenges. Every human child learns the history of our near extinctions. Every human knows that we exist because our ancestors refused to accept the inevitable. Velcros's glow shifted, perhaps with understanding. So when I threatened you with overwhelming force, you gave us exactly the kind of challenge we're built to face, Daehyun finished. And you did it while assuming we would fight the way you fight, using the tactics you understand. That was your second mistake. What was my first? Believing that power comes from domination, Daehyun said. The empire lasted 10,000 years, yes? But it was always fragile, always one crisis away from collapse. Because you ruled through fear, and fear only lasts as long as the threat backing it. The moment we showed that you could be beaten, the whole structure started to crack. Velcros stood, his full height dominating the space. But he didn't seem threatening now, just tired. So what happens to me? To my people? That depends, Daehyun said. The trials will determine individual guilt. Some imperial officials committed terrible crimes. They will be punished. But the Velthian species as a whole is not guilty. You're victims of your own system, in a way. Victims, Velcros repeated. We who ruled the galaxy, yes, Daehyun said firmly. Your society taught you that you were superior, that other species existed to serve you. You were raised in a system that gave you power, but also trapped you in a way of thinking that ultimately hurt everyone, including yourselves. He gestured at the empty chamber. Look around. The Empire gave you status, but did it give you friends? Allies? Anyone who stood by you not because they feared you, but because they cared about you? Velcros was silent. The answer was obvious. Humanity offers you something different, Daehyun said. A chance to be part of something based on cooperation instead of domination. It won't be easy. Many species hate the Velthians for what the Empire did. Trust will take time to build, but it's possible if you're willing to try. Over the following months, the former Empire's territory slowly stabilized. The Galactic Coalition was formed, a loose federation of independent species with no single dominant power. Every species had one vote. Decisions required consensus. It was messy and slow and frustrating, and it was infinitely better than what had come before. The war crime trials took place on a neutral station, presided over by judges from multiple species. Some imperial officials were convicted and sentenced to long prison terms. Others were found to have acted under orders and given lighter sentences. Emperor Velcros, as expected, was found guilty of numerous crimes including genocide, forced labor, and systematic oppression. But his sentence surprised many. Rather than execution or life imprisonment, he was sentenced to service. For the rest of his long life, he would work to rebuild what his empire had destroyed. He would help coordinate relief efforts, assist in establishing new governments, and serve as a living reminder of the dangers of unchecked power. On New Jeju, Governor Hyen oversaw the reconstruction of buildings damaged in the initial battle. The planet had become something of a symbol for human resistance, and visitors from dozens of species came to see where the Empire first learned that humanity could not be easily conquered. A group of young Velthians arrived one day. Students who wanted to understand what had happened. Hyen took time from his schedule to speak with them. One of them asked, "You could have surrendered. Lived as subjects of the Empire. Why choose war?" Hyen thought about the question. Because surrender would have meant giving up who we are. Humanity has many flaws, but we believe in certain principles. Freedom, dignity, the right to choose our own path. We couldn't accept a system that denied those things, not for us and not for others. But so many died, another student said. The cost was terrible. Yes, Hyen agreed. War is always terrible. But sometimes the cost of not fighting is worse. If we had surrendered, we would have told every species in the galaxy that tyranny works. That if you're strong enough, you can take whatever you want. That freedom isn't worth fighting for. He looked at the young Velthians. Your generation has a chance to build something better. A civilization based on mutual respect instead of domination. That's worth the cost we paid. On Earth, in a quiet park near where the United Nations had once stood, a memorial was built. It listed the names of every human who died in the war. Admiral Giwan visited it often, reading the names and remembering the faces behind them. Young soldiers who had enlisted to protect their homes, ship captains who had sacrificed themselves to save their crews, colonists who had stayed behind to operate defenses so others could evacuate. One day, she found Daehyun sitting on a bench near the memorial. He had returned to Earth after his work establishing the coalition was done. He looked older now, the stress of those years showing in his face. "Admiral," he greeted her. "I'm retired," she reminded him. "Just Juan now." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching visitors come and go from the memorial. "Do you ever wonder if we did the right thing?" Daehyun asked finally. "Every day," Guan admitted. "But then I think about what the galaxy looks like now compared to what it was. Species choosing their own governments. Trade based on mutual benefit rather than tribute. Cooperation instead of conquest. It's not perfect, but it's better. The Kresh are writing their own constitution," Daehyun said. "Kess sent me a copy. They're including provisions to prevent any one group from gaining too much power. They learned from the Empire's mistakes." "That's something," Giwan said. "The Velthians are struggling, though. Velcros told me that many of his people feel lost without the Empire. They don't know how to be anything other than rulers. They'll learn. It will take time, but they'll adapt. Humans did. We went from killing each other over resources and territory to working together. If we can change, anyone can." At the first General Assembly of the Galactic Coalition, representatives from over 800 species gathered. The chamber was designed very differently from the old Imperial Council. Instead of a hierarchy with the Emperor at the top, it was circular. Every species had the same position, the same voice. Daehyun attended as an observer, no longer officially part of humanity's diplomatic team, but respected enough that his presence was welcomed. He watched as delegates debated resource allocation, trade agreements, and defense cooperation. They argued and disagreed and sometimes got frustrated with each other, but they were doing it as equals. A young Velthian delegate approached him during a break. "Ambassador Daehyun, my name is Socrates. I wondered if I could ask your advice on a proposal." "Not an ambassador anymore," Daehyun said, "but I'm happy to help if I can." Socrates explained a complicated proposal about mineral rights on border worlds. It was the kind of technical issue that didn't have an obvious right answer, just competing interests that needed to be balanced. What do you think? Socrates asked when he finished explaining. Dehayan smiled. It was the same smile he had worn when Emperor Velcros declared war, the smile that had confused and angered so many. But now, he understood it better himself. It wasn't a smile of superior knowledge or hidden strength. It was a smile of hope. I think you should talk to the other species involved, he said. Listen to their concerns. Try to understand their perspectives, and then work together to find a solution that respects everyone's needs. That's it? Socrates seemed disappointed, as if he had expected some brilliant insight. That's it, Dehayan confirmed. Democracy is simple in theory, but hard in practice. It requires patience, empathy, and a willingness to compromise. But it works, if you give it a chance. Socrates nodded thoughtfully and returned to the assembly floor. Dehayan watched the debates continue. Watched species that had once been enemies or strangers work together on common problems. It wasn't perfect. There were still conflicts, still mistrust, still old wounds that hadn't healed. But it was better than war. Better than empire. Better than the alternative. He thought about that day in the council chamber when Velcros had issued his ultimatum. He had smiled then because he knew something the emperor didn't. He knew that humanity would fight, that they would find a way to survive, that they would turn the empire's certainty into uncertainty. But what he hadn't known, what he couldn't have predicted was this. This moment, years later, watching former subjects and former masters sitting together as equals, watching young beings from species who had never known freedom learn how to use it, watching an empire's fall give birth to something better. In the vast darkness of space, humanity's message continued to spread, not through conquest or domination, but through example. The message was simple. All beings deserve freedom. Peace is built through understanding. The future belongs not to empires, but to those brave enough to imagine something better. And somewhere, in the quantum communications that connected the coalition's far-flung members, in the trade ships that traveled between species who had once been strangers, in the schools where children of 100 different species learned together, that message took root and grew. The Galactic Empire had declared war, and humanity's envoy had smiled. Not because he knew they would win, but because he believed they had to try. And in the end, that belief had changed everything.